Hi there, and welcome. Have you ever found yourself, noticing the changing faces around you? Maybe in your city, or even like in school playgrounds, and maybe you wondered about the bigger picture behind global migration patterns.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's a huge topic, isn't it? And one that generates a lot of discussion.
For sure. So today we're taking a deep dive into one very specific viewpoint on this, one that's really rooted in history.
Okay, sounds interesting. What's the source?
Well, our source for this deep dive is actually an excerpt from a YouTube video transcript. It's got a pretty pointed title. Britain Gets a Taste of Its Own Medicine and Throws a Fit. And it's from the African Diaspora News Channel.
Right.
But what's really interesting here is that this clip features a British man, Emlyn Piers. And he steps in to offer his fellow citizens a historical perspective, basically explaining why Britain might be experiencing some of its current demographic realities.
Ah, okay. So he's kind of reacting to something specific then.
Exactly. So our mission today is really to unpack Emlyn Piers' historical argument, just as he lays it out in this source material. We want to explore the connections he's drawing, those direct lines between Britain's past actions and, well, its present-day immigration situation.
Yeah.
Especially, regarding the presence of non-white children in British schools, which seems to be the trigger.
Right. Got it. And the backstory you mentioned, the trigger, is quite telling. As you said, he's apparently responding to another British guy who was feeling alarmed, alarmed by the number of foreigners and specifically non-white children he was seeing in schools.
Yeah.
And Piers' reaction, his intervention, is to provide this historical context. His point, essentially, is that Britain's current situation isn't just random. It's a direct result, a consequence of its own past actions.
Piers certainly doesn't seem to pull any punches when he talks about that historical link to today's demographics. How does he actually illustrate that sort of causal chain, right, particularly with the examples he uses?
Well, he opens up by saying, the reason for these diverse demographics, the non-white kids in schools, is because Britain quite literally went to all these countries all over the world.
Mm-hmm.
And he lists them out, places like Canada, Jamaica, Guyana, Nigeria, Ghana, Zambia, India, Bangladesh, Syria, Australia, Papua New Guinea. Quite a list.
Wow, yeah.
And he stresses that Britain didn't just visit, it offered what he calls a package deal.
A package deal. Okay, that's an interesting phrase. What does he mean by that? What did that involve?
It seems that it was a very specific kind of, imposition. Piers points out that Britain would introduce its English language, its sports like cricket, and even structure the laws of these countries based on British legal systems.
Right.
But, and this is key, it wasn't just about, spreading culture. He really emphasizes the transactional and often exploitative side of things. He gives this example of asking India, or something like, hey, India, you want some railways so we can take more of your stuff faster.
Oof.
So it wasn't just influence, it was, as he puts it, a foundational resource extraction model, sort of laying the groundwork economically for these future, dependencies.
And this is where it gets really intense, isn't it? Because he doesn't shy away from the really dark parts of that history.
Yeah.
He specifically mentions Jamaica and asks essentially, do you want some people that we've stolen from Africa who we're going to put here, make them work for free, torture them, whip them, beat them so we can grow sugarcane and enrich ourselves? Mm-hmm. That's incredibly direct.
Extremely direct. And then he states, with total clarity, Britain did that. Britain did that of its own volition. He's really making the case that these weren't accidents. These were deliberate, conscious choices made by Britain. Mm-hmm. And what's really core here, I think, is how Piers directly links this history, the colonization, the exploitation, taking land, resources, even people, links it directly to the present-day demographic makeup of Britain. His argument seems to be that Britain was, in his words, in everybody's business, colonizing, importing people from countries who were, as he says, oblivious of Britain, not worried about Britain.
Right.
And he suggests Britain is now supposedly angry that those people stayed and more people came. He's drawing a very, very straight line there. From past actions to current consequences, he sees as undeniable.
And it's not just about direct colonization or slavery either, is it? Piers also brings in Britain's involvement in creating wars and destabilizing other governments. That comes into his argument too.
Yes, absolutely. He poses that question, right? Guess what happens when you destabilize a country?
And the answer is pretty obvious, I suppose.
Yeah, his answer is straightforward. People flee, they have to leave, their countries become unlivable, they see no way out. And if you connect that to the bigger picture he's painting, Piers suggests these people often end up coming to Britain. Why? Because for so long, Britain had effectively advertised Britain as this heaven on earth. He describes it as this Great Britain, this place where there's milk and honey. The message being pushed, maybe long before direct intervention even, was that Britain's way was the best way.
I see.
So from his perspective, it's hardly surprising that people would head towards the place held up as an ideal or maybe a sanctuary, especially if their own homes were destabilized, potentially by British actions.
Yeah, those examples he uses, introducing their laws, their values, their principles around the world, it really paints this picture of a nation actively shaping the global landscape, sometimes, quite coercively. He even mentions people being taken not just to Britain itself, but to the Caribbean too. It all seems to tie back to this central idea of active, deliberate intervention in other places.
Exactly, and this all builds towards his ultimate conclusion, at least in this source material we're looking at. Piers argues that Britain essentially did this to themselves. After all these actions, the colonizing, destabilizing, looting, exploiting people, he asks, almost rhetorically, how can Britain act shocked and surprised that people are rushing to your country and people are looking for a place to stay?
That's a powerful question.
It is, and he even points to British museums, claiming they are filled with artifacts and instruments that they've stolen, looted from other countries.
Right, the museum point.
That's another really potent image, isn't it? For Piers, it seems like another concrete example of that historical extraction. Not just people and resources, but cultural heritage, too. It just underscores his point that Britain's wealth, its identity, are deeply tangled up with its colonial past, which in his view makes the current shock seem, well, disingenuous. He presents the current situation not as a surprise, but as a direct, maybe even foreseeable outcome of those historical choices.
Okay, so wrapping this part up then. If we boil down Emlyn Piers' core argument from this source.
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear. He's basically contending that Britain's historical actions, its widespread colonization, its deep involvement in other countries' affairs, sometimes destabilizing governments, that these things directly created the demographic and immigration realities it's facing now.
Right.
He uses those examples. Britain going into India, Jamaica, Nigeria, Ghana, Zambia, Bangladesh, Syria, Australia, Papua New Guinea, and either imposing its language and laws or taking resources or even taking people, like the horrific example of slavery in Jamaica for sugarcane. And Piers consistently hammers home that Britain did this of its own volition. It wasn't accidental.
Right.
Therefore, from his viewpoint presented here, Britain can't genuinely act shocked and surprised that people from these very nations are now coming to Britain, especially since, as he argues, Britain itself had actively advertised itself as this heaven on earth, this great Britain, the land of milk and honey. And that final reference back to the museums filled with stolen, looted artifacts just serves as this final striking piece of evidence in his argument. It connects that historical pattern of taking things right up to the present day.
Okay. Well, that really brings our deep dive on Piers' perspective here to a close. His argument definitely invites you to reflect on those long-term echoes of history. So what does this all mean, really, for understanding that complex relationship between a nation's past and its present challenges? How do historical interventions, economic, political, cultural, truly shape the world we live in today, and even the demographics of nations? Something to think about. We'll leave you with that thought for now.